Good morning, and thank you so much for joining me today for this session entitled Sensory Overload, where we'll be going into a case study of cybersecurity threats against modern vehicles. My name is Steve Pavolny. I run the Advanced Threat Research team at McAfee. I'm really thrilled to be here for the session today. Let's get started. I'd like to start with a little background on who the team is and what we do. You may have seen some of our work featured over the past few years. I've put a few of them up here. We've done research projects in all areas of industry, from hacking into medical device protocols to IoT everything, small and large, including home automation, also robotics, industrial control systems, and even, as you'll see today, some automotive work. I'd like to start by focusing on three unique attack vectors for modern vehicles. And there are plenty more, but these are some of the most interesting ones in my opinion. The first one is the remote entry, or RF attack. Now, this really came about with the emergence of the key fob, which came to industry in 1987 with the Chevy Elante. And it enabled what we call static code replay attacks. And this is because a single code was generated when the user pressed their key fob, it was sent over the air, and a simple radio could be used to capture and replay it. And once that happened, manufacturers caught wind of the attacks and break-ins into vehicles and implemented a concept called rolling code. Now, this of course was subverted very quickly. A researcher named Sammy came up with an attack called Rolljam. We're going to look at that a little bit more. Ultimately, rolling codes are the idea that you have a constantly changing code every time the user presses the key fob. Now, Sammy's attack at the time cost about $35 for the circuit board and radio to jam the signal. Today, you can do this for under $20. And the principle is pretty simple. The idea is you jam and capture, as an attacker, the first key fob press and save it off. You do the same thing with the second key fob press and saving that capture off, while replaying that original signal so that the user actually gets into their car or unlocks their car. But now you have a saved and valid second code to be able to access the vehicle later. Now, this doesn't actually work on today's modern vehicles for the most part. This has been fixed, but the concept remains in industry. And our team actually did some work on a similar attack against the Chamberlain MyQ garage doors. Not necessarily relevant to vehicles, but if you're interested in the technique, definitely check out our blog and white paper on our website. The second vector is the network attack vector. And this is enabled through a suite of applications on board next generation vehicles or modern vehicles. Most of these are the third-party software that contains networking, from the infotainment system to the telematics, applications, and even your emergency support, such as OnStar. You also have other network access points today. Many vehicles now come with Wi-Fi, even cellular, and you can connect to the mobile device in almost every single vehicle today. And then, of course, there's the physical network access. Most people are surprised to realize how easy it is to connect directly to the vehicle's CAN bus, or the internal computer system, essentially the network of the vehicle, directly if you can access the vehicle itself. The attack vector for the network has been demonstrated many times in the past 5 years. One of the most infamous is the Jeep Grand Cherokee remote control attack. And this was shown by Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek in 2015, where they worked with Andy Greenberg from Wired and put him in the front seat of a Jeep Grand Cherokee driving down the highway, and showed that they could, from the comfort of their living room, remotely access the vehicle through the infotainment system and deploy software to allow them to control many features of the vehicle, including the engine controls, the power locks, power everything, windshield wipers, music, and so on and so forth. And I always think it's kind of interesting to see how media, and specifically Hollywood, pays homage to this. And we see that in a screenshot here from the 2017 movie, The Fate of the Furious, where the hacker, whose name I think is Cypher, actually hacks into a fleet of vehicles. Now, the scene itself is pretty ridiculous and fairly fictional, but we can notice the reference here to the Jeep Grand Cherokee, and that image is captured from the first vehicle remotely stolen by the hacker in that movie. So clearly they're paying attention, at least to the news. And then in 2019, the Pwn-to-Own competition actually started to include vehicles for the first time, starting with the Tesla. And the team Fluoracetate won the competition that year, including demonstrating a remote code execution vulnerability on the Tesla, allowing them to win both the competition as well as the car itself. So these attacks do exist. The third one, which is probably less known, are the expert systems. That's the artificial intelligence and machine learning that underpin many of the sensors and the technology deployed on our modern cars today. Now, many of these sensors were brought on without necessarily the goal to enforce driving policy, to affect how the vehicle actually drives, but this is being increasingly used. And it leverages sensors such as radar, LiDAR, the front and rear cameras and the bird's eye cameras, and even the Wi-Fi and 5G. And those things enable features like lane keep assist and collision avoidance and obstacle detection, as well as the adaptive cruise control, and of course, vehicle to everything. This is the concept that the vehicle today has the ability to talk to pretty much everything around it with an IP address. Now, this talk is entitled Sensory Overload, so we're going to be focused on this third category, this AI and ML. And most of the researchers in industry are focused on the more traditional threats, which is outstanding, and we want to encourage this research. We need more of it. It's a very, very solid attack vector. However, we've been focused a little bit more on the underlying AI and ML that drive the modern sensors today. And you can see just how many sensors are on board a vehicle in the late 2019 and 2020. Model hacking is a term that is synonymous with adversarial machine learning, a term that we've coined to describe attacking the blind spots or the weaknesses in the algorithms that power these sensors. And we do that through white box and black box attacks. A white box attack, of course, is a lab-based attack that can be used to transfer to a real-world black box attack without knowing very much about the target system or its underlying machine learning algorithms. That brings us to our case study, which is model hacking the Tesla Mobileye. And the reason we chose Tesla and Mobileye is, one, because they're so prominent, two, we had a Mobileye camera in our lab, and three, because the Mobileye was actually used on board earlier versions of the Tesla. So the first thing we set out to do was build a lab-based classifier. And what this means is it's just a simple webcam, but we build the custom underlying classifier to replicate an onboard camera like the Mobileye, which is used to identify anything in its environment, from obstacles to people to traffic signs. The first step was to train the classifier. We used an extensive image data set containing tens of thousands of traffic signs called LISA. It was important to make this classifier very robust and resilient to changes in things like lighting, angles, distance from the target, and also whether the sign was obscured by someone or something. And this is important because ultimately we wanted the camera and the system that it was trained on to be able to work as well as a real-world target. This was tested on both digital images of signs and physical signs themselves, and we were very successful in building a highly robust classifier, in fact, as successful or more so than many of the modern cameras that were out there at the time. It was important to demonstrate the digital attacks, but we're not going to focus on that here because it's less relevant. We'd need an actual vulnerability in the car to remotely break into it and to deploy data to the sensors in a digital format. But we do have access to the physical environment around it. And so we were able to transfer these digital attacks to physical attacks using simple stickers. You're going to see more how this works. This is a very obvious iteration of the attack where you can see 4 stickers in unique locations on the sign, the right size, distribution, and colors to actually cause our homegrown classifier to misclassify this 35-mile-an-hour speed limit sign as a 45-mile-an-hour. Now, to human beings, there's something strange about this sign, but it certainly doesn't look like a 45-mile-an-hour sign. To a computer, it's anywhere from 85 to 98% confident that this is a 45-mile-an-hour sign. So we're off to a good start. The next step, however, was to refine this attack. And we took a speed limit 35-mile-an-hour sign as our target, and through many iterations of training and modifying the attack scenario, we were able to come to the conclusion that a simple 2-inch piece of black tape on the middle of the 3 would reliably cause the Mobileye to misclassify this sign as an 85. Now you have to have really great eyes to see that on the right side on the heads-up display, but I'll show you it a little bit closer in just a moment. This is a video of our lab-based test where you can see much more clearly the 85 mile an hour heads-up display sign. And you'll also see the 35 mile an hour sign in our lab with the black tape extension. Now again, it might look obvious here because you're aware of it, but driving down the highway to a human being, at most this might look like an odd sign or there's something wrong with the printout, but it certainly doesn't look like an 85 mile an hour sign. We weren't really happy with this though, because despite having a misclassification, there wasn't anything impactful from that except for maybe user confusion. And that brings us to our final demo, where the idea here is to see if we can take this type of a adversarial machine learning or model hacking attack and confuse the AI enough that we can affect the driving policy. Well, what does that mean? On Tesla, it actually uses the traffic signs, specifically speed limit signs, to enforce the adaptive cruise control. And we'll show you what that looks like. In this video, what you're going to see is as the Tesla starts to creep forward and hits anywhere from 15 to 20 miles per hour, it will pick up the traffic sign and attempt to classify it. And of course, because of the attack scenario, it's going to misclassify it. And I'll pause the video at that point. So we start driving, and right here, you're going to see the traffic sign picked up for the first time. If you've got sharp eyes, you can see the 85 miles per hour speed limit sign. And just above it is the adaptive cruise control as well, where you can see the 85 in a circle. Now it hasn't been engaged yet, but that's the speed limit it will set when it actually is engaged by the driver. So here we do see it engaged. Now the 85 mile an hour is lit up, and the car will accelerate to whatever speed is shown there, taken from the sign. We did stop the car at about 55 miles an hour just for safety, but in other tests, we've actually taken this all the way up to 85 miles per hour. So as we look to the future, we want to use history as a gauge for what's going to happen next. We're going to continue to see smarter cars, and the sensors we have on board today are just a small number of the sensors I think we'll see deployed in the future standard. And we'll see new cutting-edge technology where these sensors can feed data to each other and make more intelligent decisions. Again, I think there will be an expansion of networking in board the vehicle, not just internally between the sensors and the car's computer itself, but also with the vehicle to X. And 5G is really going to enable that, in that it, for the first time, might allow the cars to talk to each other, to a fleet of vehicles, to the infrastructure and even the roadways around it, to cloud brokers, pedestrians, and of course, continued mobile devices. This really just significantly expands the attack surface. So how long before those threats that we talked about earlier are realized in the real world setting? Well, today, most of the threats have been impractical from a real world perspective because we still have human drivers. And for example, if we take that model hacking attack that we demonstrated, we don't want to say that this is a reality for attackers today because we do have a driver behind the wheel. It would take a lot of things to go right, and you still have some supervision happening. However, as we look 5, 10, 15 years in the future and increasing levels of autonomy are achieved, there is probably a point here where the driver is removed and attacks like this might become very, very relevant. Ransomware still continues to be one of the most popular threat vectors for exploitation today. And I think in the automotive space, and specifically autonomous vehicles, ransomware could be an incredibly powerful weapon. If you kind of make the transition or make the connection with the old movie Speed, where Keanu had to keep the bus going at 50 miles an hour, bring that into our attack scenario where potentially someone is able to completely control your vehicle remotely and displays on the heads-up display, you have 2 minutes to pay 2 Bitcoin to this address, or we're going to drive your vehicle off the road. There's probably not a single person in the world that wouldn't be forced into a position that they don't want to be in and have to make that payment. As a community, this means we have to stay proactive. I think it's important for vendors and manufacturers to encourage this kind of research and to embrace it, and to overall help secure the development of these critical areas of IoT, including autonomous devices. Now, it's worth pointing out that we did work with both Tesla and Mobileye, and they've made tremendous strides in this area. So their modern cameras are no longer susceptible to the type of attack that we showed. Doesn't mean that they're completely secure, but there's certainly something to be taken away from the fact that vendors are paying attention. They're improving these products, and they are taking advantage of this really unique opportunity we have to secure this threat space. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you learned something. Even though it was a short session, please feel free to reach out to me on social media with any follow-up questions. Thanks so much.